I would like to underscore the concerns that come out of the report to the effect that there was an increase last year in the number of executions. Lastly, we are concerned at the situation of women and girls in Iran and information reporting discrimination and harassment of this group, particularly when they exercise their rights in public. We would ask the rapporteur about what contact he's had with Iranian authorities and how they have reacted, such that he might be able to access the country and undertake his task as per his remit. Thank you. Thank you, and I give the floor to Canada. Canada would like to thank the Special Rapporteur for the ongoing efforts to catalogue human rights violations in Iran. We note that Iran has made gradual progress in certain areas. We note in particular a decrease in the number of executions following amendments to the drug laws in October 2017. Despite the progress achieved, Canada remains concerned at the human rights situation in Iran. Women, as well as members of ethnic and religious minorities, both recognized and non-recognized, are discriminated against in law and practice. We remain deeply concerned by arrests and arbitrary detention, as well as by violation of the right to freedom of opinion and expression and freedom of peaceful association and assembly. Although there has been a decrease in the number of executions, which is high, remains concerning. We are also particularly concerned by the ongoing use of the death penalty for juvenile delinquents. Mr. Special Rapporteur, what recommendations do you have for the international community to foster dialogue with the Islamic Republic of Iran with regard to the ongoing use of the death penalty against minors? Thank you. The President, thank you. I now give the floor to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. The DPRK maintains the consistent position to oppose politicization, selectivity, and double standards in the field of human rights. In this context, we categorically reject all attempts to use the human rights issue as a tool for interference in internal affairs of sovereign state and sabotage their social system chosen by their people. The report on the situation of the human rights in the Islamic Republic of Iran is far from the reality, with distorted information and incorrect reflection, disregarding positive development on the ground, thus deserving rejection from the concerned country and many others, including ours. We are of the view that any debates based on the prejudice and aimed at the political objective is not conducive but counterproductive to the genuine protection and promotion of the human rights, and therefore such practice should be discontinued. Finally, we commend and encourage the sincere efforts of the Islamic Republic of Iran for the promotion and protection of genuine human rights, rejecting any attempts for pressure and interference in domestic affairs under the signboard of human rights. Thank you.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you. I give the floor to Venezuela. Thank you, President. Mandates against countries do not offer genuine opportunity for cooperation and dialogue, which should be fundamental tools of this Council to effectively protect human rights. Their imposition gravely affects the credibility of this body. We reiterate our rejection of these mandates promoted by certain powers and their allies against sovereign states that do not subject themselves to their imperial designs. Iran has shown full cooperation with this Council. It has reported on its major progress in human rights and the implementation of the recommendations accepted in the UPR and collaborates closely with the human rights treaty bodies. It is essential for us to take an impartial, constructive and objective approach to addressing human rights challenges in any part of the world. We need to root out politicization, selectiveness and double standards as represented by these hostile mandates against countries which only address the interfering concerns of those who promote them. We reiterate our appeal for these types of hostile mandates against sovereign states to be definitively removed from the work of this Council. I thank you. Thank you. I now give the floor to Sweden.
Thank you. Sweden fully aligns itself with the statement of the European Union.
Sweden would like to thank the Special Rapporteur Rehman for his presentation. We welcome the report, which provides detailed information on the human rights situation in Iran, as well as on legislative developments and their implementation. As highlighted by the EU, the report sheds light on several important issues of long-standing concern, such as the use of the death penalty, the situation for women and girls, the rights of all persons belonging to minorities, and the respect for freedoms of expression and assembly. As was recommended by Sweden during the Universal Periodic Review of Iran in November 2019, we call upon Iran to fully cooperate and grant immediate and unfettered access for the Special Rapporteur. Even though the Special Rapporteur has not been able to visit Iran, important work has been done since the mandate was established in 2011. This includes valuable information gathering and public advocacy, which we hope and expect will continue. Sweden welcomes the improved engagement of Iran with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and would like to ask how this increased openness, in your point of view, can be used in the work of the Special Rapporteur. I thank you.
Merci.
Thank you. At this point, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Javid Rehman to address the questions and comments that he has had up until now. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. I would respond. There were clusters of questions, so I would like to respond to them together. So I'll begin with the child offender execution, which was the focus of my report in 2019. I would reiterate my recommendation that there is a complete prohibition of execution of child offenders within international law, what we call it as a norm of jus cogens. And it is important that there is an immediate end to this practice. And therefore, I would urge the international community and the states present here to have a strong focus and dialogue to ensure immediate prohibition of the practice and to have this discussion and focused, focused work on prohibiting this practice immediately. As regards the death penalty, now again I have recommended that the death penalty, I am against death penalty, and I have in my reports I have said that as an immediate priority Iran must end death penalty for crimes that are not recognized as the most serious crimes within international law. And as was mentioned by a number of states, that Iran continues to have death penalty for a number of activities which are not recognized as criminal offenses, and they are not recognized as the most serious crimes within international law. As regards November 2019 protests, again there have been a number of comments and concerns raised. In my report, I have sought and I have urged the Iranian state to have an independent investigation which should ensure full accountability and prosecution for individuals and organizations who have been involved in these huge and unacceptable forms of violations of human rights. And furthermore, I have recommended to ensure compensation for victims who have been targeted and who have suffered. And I have asked for the release of all persons who have been arbitrarily detained as a result of their exercise of peaceful protests. Now, there was a question raised about ensuring the rights of detainees. And I intend to continue to monitor and report into detentions and how these detentions take place. And particularly now it's important that we have this unfortunate scenario of COVID-19. It is all the more important that my recommendations are taken seriously. The issues that I've raised about hygiene and sanitation and overcrowding must be addressed, and the international community should raise the issue of the issue that I have highlighted in my report, including, as I say, sanitation, hygiene, and I have presented many of the recommendations, including about detentions and torture and confessions that take place. I will emphasize that with the COVID-19 threat that is there in the prisons, prisoners should be released, and I'm heartened to hear that the Iranian state has released a significant number of prisoners, but I would also urge the Iranian state to release prisoners of conscience and those who have been charged with the most serious offences, because currently they are still in detention and they face this risk of having COVID-19 virus. And I would also urge the state to have positive of ensuring that there are tests for COVID-19. As regards violation of minority rights, again in my report in 2019 I highlighted the serious concerns and the blatant discrimination against all religious and ethnic minorities. I have in particular raised the issue of unrecognized religious minorities suffering the worst forms of discrimination, and the key case is that of the Baha'is, which has been highlighted in a number of, by a number of states. As regards the situation of my mandate, a number of states have raised the issue about politicization. Now, my mandate is to focus on the human rights situation within the Islamic Republic of Iran, and not to dwell into the political aspects of the mandate. Finally, I would just briefly want to mention about my interaction with the Islamic Republic of Iran. I've had useful dialogues with the Islamic Republic of Iran. I've had meetings with representatives of Iran in New York and in Geneva, for which I'm grateful. I had a detailed meeting just this morning with the ambassador, which I would thank the ambassador. I also received detailed comments on my reports, and I am thankful. However, and that said, and a number of states did raise this issue, I am not allowed access to the Islamic Republic of Iran, which impedes my work, and I would urge the international community to enter into dialogue with the Islamic Republic of Iran to allow me access to the state. Thank you.
I thank you, sir. We will now continue with the list of speakers. I call on Albania, please. You have the floor. Thank you, Vice President. Albania welcomes the Special Rapporteur and thanks him for his report on the situation of human rights in Iran. Albania shares the Special Rapporteur's concerns on the human rights situation following national-level demonstrations in November 2019. We condemn the violence, censorship and unprecedented repression used by the Iranian security forces against their people, with over 1,500 victims, and we call for an impartial and transparent inquiry into these human rights violations. Albania is concerned by the threat against freedom of religion and freedom of expression in Iran, particularly against minority groups and religious minorities, which are now obliged to identify themselves as a member of a religion which is not their own, to obtain a national ID card and the related benefits. Albania is firmly opposed to the death penalty and remains deeply concerned by the high level of executions in Iran in violation of international law. The report also describes a regrettable situation in the detention conditions in Iran, where we note that in law and in practice, Iran is not respecting international norms. Lastly, while violence and discrimination against women remains constant in Iran, in particular given early marriage and forced marriage as well as unemployment, it is vital for Iran to undertake deep-rooted reform to legislation related to the status and rights of women today. I thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. I thank you. I give the floor to China.
Thank you, Vice President. China always stands for constructive dialogue and cooperation on human rights issues to appropriately address differences. We hope the international community takes objective and impartial approach to the human rights situation in Iran and seeks to understand Iran's challenges as a developing country in promotion and protection of human rights, and attach great importance to the aspiration of the government and people. Imposing external mechanism without consent of country concerned does not help the dialogue cooperation in the promotion and protection of human rights. Mr. Vice President, currently the Iranian government and people facing a crucial situation of fighting the epidemic, China is assisting within its capability to help Iran, including testing kits and other anti-epidemic materials and sending volunteer expert teams. China also appeals for greater international community cooperation with Iran. The unilateral sanctions imposed on Iran by some countries have great negative impact on the human rights situation of the Iranian people and have restricted the UN and other organizations from providing humanitarian assistance to them. China urged the relevant side to immediately lift these sanctions to prevent further harm to the enjoyment of human rights of the Iranian people. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I give the floor to Norway.
Thank you, Vice President. Norway thanks the Special Rapporteur for his comprehensive report and reaffirms Norway's firm support for the renewal of the mandate. The high number of executions still being carried out are of great concern. In particular, we regret the continued use of capital penalty on persons who were under the age of 18 at the time of their alleged offences. Norway deplores the continuing intimidation and discrimination of a number of ethnic and particularly religious minorities. One recent development that causes a particular concern is the introduction of new rules for obtaining new national identity cards that will exclude many Iranians from obtaining such cards, irrespective of their religion or belief, including members of the Baha'i faith. Norway would also like to share the report's concern about the continuing restrictions on the freedom of expression and assembly in Iran. The high death toll and excessive use of violence against peaceful protesters last November were most disturbing. Norway urges Iran to respect the right to peaceful protest, freedom of expression and access to information. The continuing arrests and threats against human rights defenders, including women human rights defenders, is most worrying. Human rights defenders are serving prison sentences based on vague and non-transparent criteria. Reports on harsh treatment of prisoners are of great concern. Chair, we urge the Iranian government to fulfill its human rights obligations and to swiftly implement the recommendations from the UPR hearing of Iran last year. Norway joins the rapporteur in urging Iran to cooperate fully with the rapporteur and allow him to undertake a visit to Iran. I thank you.
I thank you. Belgium has the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Vice.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Supports the statement made earlier on behalf of the European Union. Belgium would like to thank the Special Rapporteur for his detailed report and for the briefing today. We share your deep concern about the government's excessive use of force during the November 2019 protests in provinces with a majority population of ethnic minorities, and we support your recommendation for a prompt, independent and impartial investigation into all acts of violence. My country also remains seriously concerned about the wide application of the death penalty and the execution of juvenile offenders. As you have done yourself a few minutes ago, Belgium as well calls upon Iran to remove the death penalty as punishment for all offences other than the most serious crimes, pending its abolishment. Though not in line with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, child marriages remain prevalent in Iran. This harmful practice is affecting mostly girls. A law prohibiting child marriage needs to be enacted, but we know laws alone will not end child marriage. Mr. Special Rapporteur, what steps can be taken in order to change the cultural context in which these child marriages happen? Finally, Belgium supports the renewal of the mandate of the Special Rapporteur and reiterates its call to Iran to cooperate with him and thematic mandate holders in line with Iran's standing invitation. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. The United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The United Kingdom remains deeply concerned by the human rights situation in Iran. In November 2019, we witnessed the most deadly crackdown against internal unrest for decades, alongside an unprecedented near-total shutdown of the Internet. Foreign-based media outlets reporting on the unrest received threats to their staff and relatives in Iran and had assets frozen in retaliation. The UK remains concerned about the persecution and discrimination of religious minorities in Iran, particularly towards Baha'is and Christian converts. We have grave concerns about the deterioration of freedom of expression. Legitimate organisations such as the British Council continue to face false accusations. Iran remains a prolific user of the death penalty, including against juvenile offenders, which runs contrary to international treaty obligations. We share the Special Rapporteur's concern about unfair trials, ongoing arbitrary detention and mistreatment of detainees, especially dual nationals. We welcome the temporary release of 54,000 detainees following the COVID-19 outbreak and urge the Iranian authorities to ensure all detainees are afforded suitable health care and a transparent judicial process. Special Rapporteur Mr. Raymond, what steps could Iran take to ensure religious minorities do not face discrimination as a result of the new identification card process? Thank you.
Merci. Je donne
Thank you.
la parole à l'Islande.
Iceland has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Iceland thanks the Special Rapporteur for his latest report. Like him, we have found shocking the number of deaths, serious injuries and reports of ill treatment of persons detained in Iran during the November 2019 protests. We would also like to express our concerns about the continuing restrictions on freedom of expression, as well as intimidation and harassment of journalists and their families, as described in the report. Freedom of expression is a fundamental right that all states should respect and can, in our opinion, only foster a vibrant and healthy society. Stifling freedom of expression amongst its people and to actually cause injuries and fatalities in an effort to do so, in addition to mass incarceration and enforced disappearances, is wholly unacceptable. We have previously raised concerns over the use of the death penalty in the Islamic Republic of Iran and welcome the report's focus on that issue. Even though the number of executions has dropped in recent years, we call for full moratorium on the use of capital punishment and in particular the death penalty ruling for child offenders be ended altogether. Mr. Vice President, I am happy to note that Iceland has during this 43rd session of the Human Rights Council joined the core group for the resolution on the situation of human rights in the Islamic Republic of Iran, primarily focusing on the Special Rapporteur's mandate renewal, and we call upon the Council to support the renewal of your mandate at this session. Thank you.
My thanks. I now give the floor to North Macedonia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. North Macedonia thanks the Special Rapporteur for presenting his extensive report on the situation of the human rights in the Islamic Republic of Iran. We remain preoccupied about recurring cases of violation of human rights as noted in the report. We recognize the significant decrease in executions, a consequence of the amended drug trafficking law in 2017. Nevertheless, the high number of executions, including public executions and executions of juvenile offenders, remains of serious concern. We reiterate the call of the Special Rapporteur to remove the death penalty as punishment for all offences other than the most serious crimes as a step towards its full abolishment. We are also concerned about repeated reports of failure to provide minimum trial guarantees in criminal proceedings, as well as numerous reports of use of torture and ill treatment in prisons. We call upon the government to comply with its human rights obligations under international law on detainees and prisoners. In addition, we note the continuous discrimination of religious and ethnic minorities and discrimination against women and girls, and we encourage the government to continue working towards addressing all forms of discrimination at all levels. Finally, we condemn the use of excessive force during the November 2019 protests, and we call upon the Iranian authorities to guarantee respect of the freedoms of opinion, expression, peaceful assembly and association of all citizens. Being member of the core group on the resolution on Iran, we call upon member states of the Council to extend the mandate of the Special Rapporteur. I thank you.
Thank you. Australia has the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Vice-Président.
Thank you, sir.
Australia remains deeply concerned by the human rights situation in the Islamic Republic of Iran and notes the Special Rapporteur's latest report. Australia encourages ongoing engagement with Iran on human rights issues, including through our bilateral human rights dialogue and in multilateral fora. Australia is concerned about reports of deaths of protesters and ill treatment of detained persons during recent protests. Australia calls on Iran to uphold international standards of procedural guarantees to ensure fair trials and due process, and for proper accountability of security entities, including during times of protests. We encourage Iran to safeguard freedom of expression and ensure journalists and activists do not face intimidation. Australia urges Iran to eliminate discrimination on gender, ethnic and religious grounds. We urge Iran to impose a moratorium on the death penalty and to release political prisoners. Australia continues to encourage Iran to ratify the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women and the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman or Degrading Treatment or Punishment. We continue to urge Iran to engage more fully with UN human rights mechanisms. Thank you.
Merci, Madame.
I thank you, Madam. The Czech Republic, you have the floor.
President, the Czech Republic fully associates itself with the intervention on behalf of the EU. We thank the Special Rapporteur, Javaid Rehman, for his report and presentation that provide detailed information on the human rights situation in Iran. We reiterate once again our full support to his mandate. We firmly do believe that the Special Rapporteur's counter-visit conducted based on an unhindered access would be highly significant and would enable him to strengthen engagement with the authorities on human rights. We take positive note of the government's engagement and dialogue between the government of Iran and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. The continued use of death penalty against juvenile offenders and a practice that remains a deep concern for us. We urge the Iranian authorities to abolish the death penalty and introduce an immediate moratorium on its use and to prohibit the execution of child offenders in all circumstances and commute their sentences. We are deeply committed to the protection and promotion of all human rights, such as freedoms of opinion and expression online and offline, as well as freedom of peaceful association and assembly. Therefore, we remain worried by the arrest, detention and harassment of human rights defenders, lawyers, journalists, writers, labor rights activists, artists and environmentalists, as well as by human rights violations in many other areas identified by the Special Rapporteur. I thank you.
Merci.
Thank you. Armenia has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Armenia highly values its bilateral relations with the Islamic Republic of Iran and the traditional cordial attitude of the government and people of Iran towards historic Christian communities. We praise Iran's consistent course to protect the Christian Armenian monuments and appreciate that a number of them were inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List. We also note with appreciation that allocation of parliamentary seats to the religious minorities, as well as provision of various financial means to the centers and groups of religious minorities. Armenia highlights the importance of Iran's membership to the core international human rights instruments and treaties. We note with appreciation that in November 2019, a delegation by the Secretary of High Council for Human Rights actively participated in the review of the Islamic Republic of Iran in the context of the third cycle of UPR process. We encourage it to continue in constructive engagement with OHCHR and follow up on recommendations. It is our conviction that the UN human rights machinery are well placed to provide necessary expertise and assistance to the member states in their efforts for strengthening the protection and promotion of the fundamental freedoms. The people of Iran can largely benefit from genuine, coherent, needs-based and result-oriented cooperation in this regard. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank you. I give the floor to Belarus.
Mr. Vice President, Belarus, as a point of principle, does not support the adoption of country resolutions and country mandates, at the heart of which lie politically motivated decisions. The UPR mechanism alone is the universally recognized intergovernmental system for review of human rights by states. The Islamic Republic of Iran, in good faith, participates in the UPR and every time provides persuasive confirmation of its commitment to promoting and protecting human rights at the national level. Iran has achieved significant progress, including in healthcare and education, and is among the countries that rank highly in terms of human development. We very much welcome these outcomes and would note at the same time that the country has had to overcome difficulties in connection with the imposition against it of unilateral coercive measures. We do not accept the report of the Special Rapporteur as a matter of principle in view of its inherent absence of objective grounds for preparation and review. Belarus calls for the cessation of the mandate, an end to politicization of the human rights situation in the country, and an end to the imposition against the Iranian people of unilateral coercive measures. Thank you.
Thank you. That's the last speaker on my list. We will now continue with the list of non-governmental organizations. And I call on by the international community.
Madam President, Iran's government has for decades denied the rights of its Baha'i citizens. Now they are taking this further by denying them their official identities, the national ID cards that allow any Iranian citizen to carry out everyday civil and official tasks. Opening a bank account is impossible without an ID card. Applying for a loan is impossible without an ID card. Obtaining work permits, making bank transactions, buying or selling homes, applying for passports. No one in Iran can do any of these without an ID card. And the Iranian government has effectively barred every Baha'i in Iran from applying for one. This ID card should be available to every citizen. However, a new criteria requires that applicants choose from one of 4 recognized religions: Islam, Christianity, Judaism, and Zoroastrianism. Madam President, when a Baha'i in Iran recently tried to apply for their ID card, the Document Registration Office said that their religion was not sanctioned by law and advised them to use one of the 4 available options. Baha'is will not lie about their faith as a matter of principle. But how strange for a government to advise citizens to lie and to falsify official documents. This the Baha'is will not do. Mr. Rahman, barring Baha'is from applying for ID cards turns each of them into non-persons. What can the international community do to stop a new and far-reaching form of persecution that appears designed to hollow out the Baha'i community once and for all?
Merci.
Thank you. And I give the floor to Brabord Educational Services Cooperative.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Comprehensive sanctions against Iran are seriously violating all human rights of all Iranians, including the right to education. About 4 million Iranian students are subject to collective punishment due to comprehensive sanctions. More than 60,000 Iranian students studying abroad are facing multiple financial issues in money transfers to pay university fees, maintaining their bank accounts, or receiving education loans as Iranian nationals. My organization draws the Special Reporter's attention to the fact that Iranian students are subject to serious racial discrimination and limitation of access to education because of their nationality. Also, the comprehensive sanctions imposed on Iran makes it impossible for more than 3.5 million university students studying inside Iran to access scientific journal articles and references because of the sanctions on the access to academic resources. Mr. Special Rapporteur, my organization urges Your Excellency to voice the concerns expressed by all Iranian students who are facing various forms of violation of the right to education as well as discrimination based on their nationalities. We urge Your Excellency to condemn this discrimination in joint statements with the Special Reporter on Education. We also request Your Excellency to offer the 4 million Iranian students with recommendations on how to receive assistance in order to deal with the multiple challenges they are facing because of the imposition of comprehensive sanctions on Iran. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Organization for Defending Victims of Violence.
Mr. Vice President, within the past decades, Iran-based NGOs have been striving for promotion of all human rights inside Iran, including the rights of patients, women, children, migrants, vulnerable groups, and people with disabilities who receive less attention in the reports of the special rapporteurs. However, the economic warfare enforced on Iran is seriously shrinking the resources available to NGOs, including medicine, food items, and financial donations. The sanctions that amount to de facto blockade subject Iran population to collective punishment, causing indiscriminate and disproportionate suffering to all people. This form of economic war deprived the target country of many resources, including national source of income and all international banking transactions. Mr. Vice President, noting the fact that the Special Rapporteur has allocated part of his report to the negative effects of sanctions on Iranians, ODVV urges him to pay due attention to the negative impact of economic war, which is crippling the enjoyment of all human rights in Iran, and join the other thematic mandate holders, including the Special Rapporteur on UCMs, and take serious steps, including release of joint statement to mitigate and stop the detrimental effects of economic war in Iran. ODV will also recommend the reports of a Special Rapporteur to make more references to the information offered by Iran-based NGOs who have access to valid underground information. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Give the floor to Family Health Association of Iran.
Rahman, my country has been facing with unilateral and multilateral sanctions after Islamic Revolution. These sanctions have affected all aspects of Iranian lives. One of the most important impacts has been the effect on the rights of Iranian patients, especially patients with special and rare diseases. Banking sanctions have created many problems for importing of food, medicine, and medical equipment, so it causes deficiency of medicine and highly increasing of price, especially for patients with special and rare diseases. Foreign drugs companies refrain from selling raw materials to Iran. For example, in 2019, the drugs company related to the foam absorbent dressing for treating children with EB had refrained from providing the medical dressing due to the sanction and EB children's inaccessibility to this special dressing. At least 15 sick children died last year because of the infection. Hemophilia patients do not have permanent, timely, and safe access to medicine because even insurance and transportation companies are under sanctions. Western countries refrain from providing Iran with blood purification and transfusion equipment. FHA Iran calls HRC to immediately take steps for the support and lifting the sanctions against people of Iran. Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole.
Thank you. I give the floor to Ensemble contre la peine de mort.
Thank you, Mr. President. ECPM and Kurdistan Human Rights Geneva welcome the report of the Special Rapporteur on Iran and strongly support the renewal of this mandate. The report shows that minorities continue to be victims of serious and fundamental violations of their rights. In 2019, over 1,500 Kurds were detained and 150 of them were charged with fabricating security-related crimes. The Kurdish political prisoners constitute 50% of all Iran's political imprisonment. Iran remains amongst the top executions per capita in the world. There are over 200 acts for which the death penalty is foreseen in the Iranian criminal law, and many of these capital offenses do not meet the threshold of the most serious crimes. More than 260 persons have been executed in 2019, including individuals who were under the age of 18 at the time of the crime. Ethnic minorities are overrepresented in the death penalty statistics, while the Kurdish people in Iran amount only to 13% of Iran's 80 million population. Their share of execution is over 25%. We are also extremely concerned about the extrajudicial executions of Kurdish citizens. According to our data in 2019, 276 Kurdish civilians, known as Kobran, were victims of direct shooting by Iranian security forces. We call on the international community to take all the necessary steps to protect Kurdish people and all Iranian citizens against huge violations of their fundamental human rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I give the floor to International Federation of Journalists. Microphone, please.
Since the protests in November, Iran has increased its intimidation of family members of BBC Persian journalists. Our relatives have been interrogated and their passports confiscated. Together with my colleagues, I'm being harassed and persecuted by Iran because of my reporting. BBC Persian broadcasts in Farsi to over 20 million people around the world. Since 2009, the Iranian authorities have been systematically harassing us and our families. We can't return to Iran for fear of arrest. Colleagues have lost loved ones without being able to say goodbye or attend funerals. I receive daily death threats online. I was recently told that I'm not safe in London, that they will cut my children's throats, and that I will be assassinated. In 2017, Iran began an investigation into staff at the BBC Persian service on charges of conspiracy against national security, and our assets were frozen. We now know that the investigation and asset freeze has been extended to many other Iranian journalists working outside Iran. We urge the Special Rapporteur and the Council to make respect for free press central to engagement with Iran.
Thank you, Madam. I give the floor to Civicus.
Thank you, Madam President, Special Rapporteur.
Volunteer activists and civicists note with concern the continued closure of civic space through restrictive laws, arbitrary detention, and a crackdown on civil society. The violent response to nationwide protests in November 2019 resulted in 1,500 killed by police and over 7,000 imprisoned, many of whom have been subjected to torture. We reiterate the Special Rapporteur's call for prompt, independent, and impartial investigations into the violence in order to hold those responsible to account. This is a further deterioration of closed civic space in which freedom of assembly is severely and violently curtailed, and scores of human rights activists remain detained, including Nasrin Sotoudeh, Narges Mohammadi, Farhad Messami. Iran continues to restrict civic space through ambiguous and overbroad legislation. Article 26 of the Constitution guarantees the right to the freedom of association, but qualified through compliance with vague standards. In line with the recommendations in the Special Rapporteur's report, we urge the government of Iran to immediately and unconditionally release all protesters and human rights defenders detained for their work. We urge the government to reform its legal framework to facilitate a more open environment for civil society and put an immediate end to all extra-legal processes that curtail civic space. We further call on the Council to renew its critical mandate, and we ask the Special Rapporteur to expand further on what more could be done to protect human rights defenders in Iran. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. I call Article 19.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We share the Special Rapporteur's deep concerns about the repression of human rights defenders and dissenting voices in Iran, facilitated by the continued abusive application of a restrictive legal framework and abuses by the security forces. Since November 2019, authorities have applied excessive and even lethal force against protesters. The death toll ranges from verified reports of 304 killings to unconfirmed reports of 1,500 killings, with thousands of other protesters injured or arbitrarily detained by security forces simply for exercising their rights. Amir Hossein Moradi, Saeed Tamjidi, and Mohammed Rajabi, protesters from Tehran, were sentenced to death on trumped-up charges of cooperating in vandalism and arson. They must be immediately and unconditionally released and their convictions quashed. Article 19 calls on Iran to open independent, effective, and transparent investigations into the excessive use of force against peaceful protesters. Those responsible must be held to account in courts of law and the victims granted access to remedies. We are deeply concerned by the authorities' accelerating efforts to control freedom of expression and information online. The unprecedented internet shutdowns during recent protests frustrated the organization of peaceful assemblies and prevented effective monitoring of rights violations by security forces. We remind the government and this Council that such measures violate international human rights law and must be condemned. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Merci.
Thank you.
To the representative of Center for Inquiry.
The Special Rapporteur's report on Iran shows that the Iranian regime continues to unashamedly violate human rights in all areas. We thank the Rapporteur for mentioning the exceptionally hideous case of Sabah Afshari. This 20-year-old student was arrested because she had protested against the unaffordable living costs for ordinary citizens, raised awareness about political prisoners, and made a short video of herself not wearing a hijab. Like many other Iranian women, Afshari does not want to act as a poster girl for Islamist doctrine and therefore opposes the obligation to cover her hair. Last year, Sabah Afshari was arrested for her civic activities and given a grotesque 24-year sentence. And last month, her mother, Rahele Ahmadi, was also sentenced to 4 years in prison after making a video to raise awareness about the farcical trial against her daughter. Like many other feminists, secularists, humanists and other human rights campaigners, these two brave women are political prisoners and should be freed immediately. We urge the Special Rapporteur and the HRC delegates to pressure the Iranian regime to implement the changes specified by the Secretary-General. Human rights are universal and, like all countries, Iran is obligated to respect and enforce them. Thank you.
Thank you. Amnesty International.
Mr. Vice President,
The worsening human rights situation in Iran requires urgent and ongoing attention by this Council and continued monitoring and reporting and documentation by the Special Rapporteur. The authorities have continued to suppress the rights to freedom of expression, association, and peaceful assembly. In recent months, Iran's security forces have crushed peaceful protests using unlawful, including lethal force. In November 2019, in an unprecedented crackdown, they killed more than 300 protesters and bystanders and injured and arbitrarily arrested thousands of others, according to credible reports received by Amnesty International. Torture and other ill treatment, including through the denial of medical care, remain widespread. The authorities systematically violate defendants' fair trial rights, including through the denial of access to a lawyer at the investigation stage. Women face entrenched discrimination in family and criminal law contexts. Women's rights defenders campaigning against discriminatory forced veiling laws are serving lengthy prison sentences. Authorities continue to execute individuals who are under the age of 18 at the time of the alleged crime. For these reasons, we urge this Council to renew the mandate of the Special Rapporteur, and we urge the Iranian authorities to cooperate with the mandate. I thank you.
Merci.
Thank you.
Ceci était la dernière intervention.
This was the last statement that we were able to accommodate in the course of this dialogue. I would now like to give the floor to Mr. Rehman for his concluding comments and remarks. You have the floor, sir.
I will have my concluding statement in this presentation. A number of points I want to raise. Firstly, on the issue of sanctions. If you review my reports of last year and this present report, I have highlighted the impact of sanctions, being critical and raising the point that sanctions have worsened economic and social rights. I note the point that's made about the impact of sanctions on education, and I've also highlighted the negative impact of sanctions, including access to medical supplies. I would urge the international community to work together to alleviate this suffering. I regret the significant number of deaths that are taking place as a consequence of COVID-19, and there is a clear relationship of the right to health and issues arising from limitations or non-access to medical supplies. And therefore I call upon the international community to look into this matter, investigate the negative impact of sanctions, particularly those relating to medical supplies, and mitigate these sanctions. I recognize that Iran has released many prisoners to stem the outbreak of COVID-19, but at the same time I urge Iran to release all prisoners of conscience, including the release of human rights defenders, lawyers, and journalists. I would also urge the Islamic Republic of Iran to release all dual and foreign nationals where we know that now there is a serious risk of disease and of COVID-19. Furthermore, I would urge the Islamic Republic of Iran to have a fully transparent system in relation to COVID-19 and to ensure that the international community receives accurate and updated information as to what measures are being taken to stop the spread of this disease. I also wanted to make a point about the Ukraine airline disaster, which was an unmitigating a tragedy of serious consequences for people both within Iran and outside of Iran. I would urge the Iranian state to conduct an open, independent investigation which should be impartial. I would urge the Iranian state to stop the harassment of families of those individuals who have unfortunately perished. I would urge the Iranian state and the international community to work together towards a substantial and a fair compensation scheme for those individuals who have lost their loved ones. In relation to the detention conditions, I have again highlighted that in my report. I'm concerned about the torture, the forced confessions, and the breaches of fair trial and rule of law that is taking place, and I have made recommendations in my report as to how to make progression on that. Points were made about child marriages and violence against children and women. I condemn these practices in strong terms. It is very important to have a dialogue with the Iranian state to ensure and to inform in no uncertain terms that child marriages and violence against children and women are unacceptable practices within international law, and they must immediately be stopped. I have already made my comments about child offender executions. I will just reiterate that there has to be a complete prohibition of the execution of child offenders within international law, and it is important that there is an immediate end to this practice. In relation to the November 2019 protests, these were the worst human rights violations not witnessed in decades. Killing of those who are exercising their lawful right to protest, and I would seek independent and impartial investigations with full accountability and prosecution of those who were acting in these circumstances. And I would urge urge the Iranian state to ensure compensation for the victims. I wouldn't have so much time, but just a brief comment in relation to freedom of expression. I condemn the harassment of journalists, especially journalists from the BBC Persian. I raised the alarm post-November protests and talking about the harassment of journalists and threats to their families, and also the internet shutdown. And I condemn these activities, and I have urged in my report a full and a comprehensive assessment and investigation as to the reasons and outcome of any investigation that takes place. I would end here, Your Excellency, because I know that time has come to an end. Thank you.
Thank you. Ceci nous amène à la fin de...
This brings us to the end of this interactive dialogue. I would like to thank Mr. Neman for his presence and for participating in this session.
Bonjour. Ça va et vous?
I would shake your hand except for the protocol that we have now.
Yes.
Excellence. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, could I kindly ask you to take your seats so that we can resume our work? We will now begin our interactive dialogue with the Commission of Inquiry on Burundi. The list of speakers will close in 15 minutes. I have the honour to welcome here to the podium the members of the Commission of Inquiry on Burundi, Mr. Doudou Diène, Ms. Lucy Aswagbo, and Ms. Françoise Hampson. Welcome all of you, and I would like to give the floor first of all to Mr. Doudou Diène for his presentation. You have the floor, sir. President, thank you. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, since the renewal of its mandate in September 2019, the Independent Commission of Inquiry on Burundi has continued to carry out the mission it was entrusted with, while observing the highest standards of rigour and impartiality. This year, our investigations focus on the violations of civil, political, economic and social rights in a tense electoral context susceptible to human rights violations. We have already carried out field missions in Uganda, Rwanda and Tanzania in order to collect information from victims and direct witnesses of human rights violations and abuses that were recently committed in Burundi. We wish to express our gratitude to the Member States that cooperated with the Commission by facilitating access to their territory. Since September 2019, we have collected approximately 130 new witness accounts. We also thank the persons who provided valuable information despite the risks involved. We regret the fact that some of them had to deal with acts of intimidation and threats. We reiterate the condemnation expressed by this Council regarding, and I quote, all acts of intimidation or reprisals carried out by state and non-state agents directed against individual groups who have cooperated with the United Nations, its representatives of mechanisms in the field of human rights. We commend the efforts of states to investigate allegations of intimidations or reprisals. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in our September 2019 report, we concluded that the 8 risk factors common to criminal atrocities were present. After the last few months, we've observed that the evolution of the situation remains a cause of concern. We note a deterioration of the situation in regards risk factor number 1 on political, economic and security instability. Despite the official statements from Burundian authorities claiming that there is peace and security in Burundi, several serious incidents that occurred recently attest to the volatility of the situation. On the 22nd of October 2019, in Bubanza province, there were armed clashes. On the 16th of November 2019, in Cibitoke province, between the 19th and 23rd of February 2020, in the province of Bujumbura Rural, the official figures indicated that 22 quote-unquote armed criminals and 2 police officers were killed. However, several of these armed men were killed after their capture and not during combat, which constitutes, President, extrajudicial executions and serious violations of the right to life. We firmly condemn all these attacks, which resulted in several casualties and serious injuries, including, I would stress, amongst Burundian armed forces. Various measures taken by the Burundian authorities clearly indicate growing concerns with the security situation. For example, on the 15th of January 2020, the Permanent Secretary of the National Security Council instructed the general population to look out for unknown persons on their colline and to notify the local authorities accordingly. On the 21st of November 2019, the Mayor of Bujumbura issued a directive for bars to only open properties to have only 2 lamps on each property, and to monitor cahiers de ménage carefully. The economic situation has further deteriorated. Decisions by the government to monopolize the trade of gold and foreign currencies, the prohibition of foreign money transfers by the main mobile telecommunication operators, as well as the management takeover of the coffee sector by the government, are all last resort measures to rectify the acute lack of foreign currency, which prevents imports and creates shortages of basic products and medicine. In parallel, the population continues to be forced to give regular contributions, including contributions to support the ruling party, while the majority experience severe economic precariousness, with 1.74 million Burundians in a quote-unquote situation of need. The humanitarian situation remains alarming, with 336,000 refugees still in various neighbouring countries as of the 31st of January 2020, of whom 5,734 were registered from the 1st of September 2019. Following a brief hiatus since 7th of November 2019, the repatriation convoys between Tanzania and Burundi resumed on the 6th of February 2020. 814 Burundians were repatriated in the month of February 2020. According to our investigations, the voluntary nature of these repatriations remains doubtful. The second and third risk factors related to the widespread climate of impunity for serious human rights violations and to the weakness of state structures remain relevant. The Imbonerakure continue to enjoy near total impunity. President, we would, however, make an exception. The sentencing to life imprisonment of 4 Imbonerakure, pronounced on the 8th of October 2019 for the assassination in August 2019 of a member of the opposition party. We observed a more ambiguous development regarding risk factor number 4, namely the existence of intentions and motives to resort to violence, particularly the desire of the ruling party to hold on to power, including by using past grievances and cases of impunity for political purposes. Over the last few months, the priority of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has been the exhumation of remains buried in various mass graves. On the 4th of March 2020, the President of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission announced that 7,348 victims of the 1972 massacres were exhumed, and that, and I quote, momentum of peace and national unity will necessarily require the truth on the 1972 tragedy, end quote. However, critical voices pointed out that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission seems to only be interested in the 1972 victims, who are mainly from the Hutu ethnic group, which is significant given that these exhumations are taking place a few months before crucial elections. President, it is our hope that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission will be able rapidly to show a genuinely inclusive and impartial approach. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, concerning risk factor number 5, the capacity of diverse actors to resort to violence and to carry out violations, the recent security incidents are all reminiscent of the existence of different armed groups and their capacity to intervene on Burundian territory. Similarly, the omnipresence of Imbonerakure in mixed security committees and in collines is of great concern. The Permanent Secretary of the National Security Council has moreover recalled that the mixed security committees should not replace the police nor the judicial system. On the 3rd of March 2020, the Minister of the Interior ordered the suspension until the 27th of April, the official start date of the electoral campaign, of all rallies organised by youth affiliated to political parties. These decisions are positive, and the Commission hopes that they will have an impact. The lack of motivating factors, such as a solid, organised and representative national civil society and free, diversified and independent national media, risk factor number 6, has seen an increase. The government's media censorship has increased by imposing without prior consultation a quote-unquote code of conduct. 4 journalists from the Ivaku group, one of the last independent media outlets still operating in the country, were sentenced on the 30th of January 2020 to 2.5 years in prison, despite the fact they were merely carrying out their professional duty. The control of NGOs and their activities has continued. In February 2020, foreign NGOs received an order to provide a list of all of their staff members, indicating their ethnic group and gender for national staff. The government has continued to use the judicial systems to silence civil society and the media. Human rights defenders remain arbitrarily detained. In particular, Germain Rukuki, who was sentenced on the 26th of April 2018 to 32 years in prison. At the regional level, we note that there is still no progress in the inter-Burundian dialogue process, especially after the departure of the facilitator, His Excellency Benjamin Mkapa, on the 1st of February 2019, with no one appointed to replace him. We note the deterioration of risk factor number 6 with the emergence of 2 new indicators. Firstly, the indifference or reluctance of some UN member states to act, despite the fact that Burundi has clearly failed to shoulder its responsibility to protect its population against the risks of atrocity crimes, indicator 6, little Roman 1. We note some lack of support by neighbouring countries to protect the Burundian population seeking refuge, with refugees placed in an untenable situation, forcing them to accept repatriation, indicator 6J. Risk factor 7 on enabling circumstances and a conducive environment of violence and human rights violations, including manipulation for political purposes of identity, past events, etc., has increased. We are very concerned by the increase in hate speech with a political and/or ethnic dimension. This is circulating unrestricted on social media. We also note the silence of the Burundian authorities on this matter. With regard to risk factor 8, i.e. the existence of triggering factors such as the holding of elections, we note the ongoing preparation of different ballots between May and August 2020. The Electoral Commission has begun registering candidates for the various elections, including Mr. Agathon Rwasa, the CNL candidate, and Mr. Évariste Ndayishimiye, the candidate for the CNDD-FDD. The candidacy of this latter cements President Nkurunziza's announcement that he would not stand for re-election. The Commission of Inquiry therefore appeals to Mr. Ndayishimiye and the 9 other presidential candidates to make firm commitments to respect and protect human rights. President, we note the spectacular benefits and privilege that will be granted to President Nkurunziza at the end of his term. The current president has been appointed, I quote, Supreme Guide of Patriotism for the country, close quote, which gives him an official advisory role. We question the institutional significance and the political consequences of this decision on future power stability in Burundi.
Finalement, nous ne pouvons que déplorer.
Finally, we can only deplore the prevalence of political intolerance in all the provinces of the country. We have already documented numerous human rights violations that have been committed since September 2019, mainly targeting political opponents, including several CNL members. They have been arbitrarily arrested and detained for participating in their party's activities. Some were also victims of violence and torture, while many others were killed. Their family members, especially women, have also been targeted and were victims of serious violations, including sexual violence. Just a few days ago, the President of the National Independent Human Rights Commission of Burundi expressed his concern. Acts of intimidation, harassment and extortion of Burundian returnees from Tanzania have continued, generally speaking. In some cases, these were accompanied by serious violations. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, by keeping you informed of existing risks and concerns on the developments of the situation, our Commission has already responded to the call for action in favour of human rights and the prevention of violations recently launched by the UN Secretary-General. In the short term, we are making a solemn appeal, in particular to states in the region and the sub-region, to join forces to encourage the reopening by the Burundian government of the democratic, civil and political space in Burundi, which is an absolute requirement for the holding of free, transparent and credible elections in a peaceful climate amid political tolerance. Nevertheless, Mr. Vice President, we have reaffirmed that the primary responsibility for the protection of its population remains in the hands of the government of Burundi. In this regard, it is important for the latter to demonstrate its willingness to fulfill this obligation by immediately taking strong and concrete measures to mitigate the risk factors, which we recommended in our previous report. More generally, the implementation of all our recommendations remains more crucial than ever. Their implementation is the only way of putting Burundi on the path to long-term stability. The elections will not in themselves resolve the deep crisis that Burundi has been going through since 2015. However, holding credible elections would be an important sign of democratic change and of respect for human rights. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, after long years of suffering, the Burundian people have the right to live in a reconciled society set in a peaceful, democratic, economic and social environment. Thank you for your attention.
Merci.
Thank you. I should like to inform delegations that the list of speakers is now closed. In line with established practice, we will begin by hearing the delegation of the country concerned by this statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Burundi. You have 5 minutes.
Monsieur le Vice-Président,
Mr. Vice President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the delegation of Burundi would like to extend its warm and sincere congratulations to Her Excellency Ms. Elisabeth Tiché-Fisberger for her election to the presidency of the Human Rights Council. We wish her every success. Burundi is participating in this interactive dialogue with this Commission of Inquiry, not out of concern to collaborate with it, the Commission of Inquiry, but out of respect towards the Human Rights Council and out of a duty to cooperate with it. This cooperation is to be understood in the sense of strict respect of the sacrosanct principles of neutrality, objectivity, non-politicization and non-selectiveness which must characterize the Council. This Commission is the 4th mandate imposed on Burundi. The mandate assigned to it by Resolution 3324 of the Human Rights Council in September 2016 has regularly and artfully changed its nature and scope. A situation which offers reasonable grounds to believe that this Commission rather has a mandate for lobbying, convinced of its capacity to impose its dictate for its own interests. Such a commission is supposed to have an independent status. However, the independence of this commission is in name only. This is a commission which, through its reports, has flagrantly violated the code of conduct assigned to the mandate holders under these special procedures by Resolution 5.2 of the Human Rights Council, in particular Article 7, 8, Article 8D, Articles 9, A, C and E, Article 12, A and B, and Article 13, B and C. Since its creation in 2016, this Commission has stood out because of its reports, which contain lies, defamation and insults. They cheerfully denigrate the legal order, the administrative and governmental authorities in Burundi, beginning with the head of state, insulting and listing the state bodies, the police, the National Intelligence Service, demonizing the young Imbonerakure and laying them bare to the world's disdain. They themselves, however, are human beings and they have rights which must be protected and promoted. Among the concerns of this Commission was the fact that the party in power, the CNDD-FDD, had not revealed the name of its future candidate for presidential elections in May 2020, and it concluded that the head of state, His Excellency Pierre Nkurunziza, was going to seek a further mandate and therefore plunge the country into chaos. Given this negativistic and politicized reading, my delegation would like to recall that during its National Congress on the 26th of January 2020, the CNDD-FDD elected its candidate for the next presidential elections, the General Major Evariste Ndayishimiye. On the political level, the political space is free and peaceful, and the Burundians are preparing to go to peaceful elections on the 20th of May 2020 based on resources, domestic resources. Participation of all political actors is more observed now than ever. In fact, the Independent National Electoral Commission has already received the filing of 10 candidacies for the presidential elections. 7 candidates from the opposition and 2 independent candidates are included there. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, given the attitude of this Commission, Burundi would recall the Charter of the United Nations, which states that nothing contained in the present Charter shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state, or shall require the members to submit such matters for settlement under the present Charter, Articles 2.7. Burundi would like to also inform the Council and the international community that it will never allow itself to be distracted by reports which do not contribute to improving the rights of Burundian people, but rather simply polarize Burundian society, tarnish the image of the country and discredit the Human Rights Council. This Commission was created in the wake of the 2015 events, an electoral year, and is today disconnected from the socio-political reality of Burundi 5 years later. It should bow to reports from different United Nations agencies in Burundi which give a completely objective reading of the situation, which is totally opposed to that of this Commission. In line with the situation of the country, Burundi would like to invite the different capitals to reassess their reading of the country and to definitively turn the page from 2015, as that reality no longer exists. Facing the voluntary mass return of refugees, Burundi would like to urge host countries to facilitate the voluntary return of these refugees, rather than holding them hostage under any false pretext. On peace and security, Burundi will say that there are no lessons to be learned from this Commission. It is its daily duty to protect the population from any evil acts, whatever their nature or origin. In conclusion, Burundi would ask the Human Rights Council to accept a positive reading by the United Nations of the situation in Burundi, rather than allowing itself to be blinded by a Commission which has already been used by geopolitical lobbies under the cover of human rights protection. Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. I should now like to ask all delegations to use appropriate language in this human rights forum. I believe this is of the utmost importance, that when discussions and statements are delivered on human rights, that everyone avoid comments which are not respectful. I count on your cooperation to ensure that our discussions can be carried out in all due respect. I thank you. I now invite interested delegations to ask questions and to make comments on the oral statement from the Commission of Inquiry.
Je donne à présent la parole.
I now give the floor to the European Union.
Merci, Monsieur le Vice-président.
Thank you, Vice President. The European Union welcomes the Commission of Inquiry and thanks it for its presentation and the work that it's been doing to keep the Burundian crisis on the international agenda. We continue to closely follow the human rights situation in Burundi. Recent incidents are extremely serious. An independent and impartial inquiry must be carried out. The situation in Burundi remains tense and worrying. Members of the Young People's League of the party in power continue to act in full impunity. Restrictions on freedoms of expression, assembly and association do not promote an inclusive and transparent electoral process. We encourage all political actors to respect the code of conduct which they have signed and to commit to a peaceful political debate. The European Union would encourage Burundi to take immediate measures to put an end to human rights violations and to resume cooperation with international and regional human rights mechanisms. We would have a question to the Commission of Inquiry to that end, namely what, in your view, are the short-term actions that should be taken by the Burundian authorities with that end in mind? Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. Australia has the floor.
Thank you, Vice President. Australia thanks the Commission of Inquiry for its oral update and ongoing work. Australia remains deeply concerned by human rights violations and abuses in Burundi, including reports of extrajudicial abductions, torture and killings taking place amid a climate of impunity. Australia urges the government of Burundi to end these violations and abuses, hold those responsible to account and ensure that government security forces and the Imbonerakure comply with international human rights law. Ahead of general elections in May 2020, we acknowledge that a new candidate rather than the current president will stand for the ruling party. However, we remain concerned that fear and intimidation will continue to be used to repress political opponents. Australia urges the government of Burundi to take urgent steps to support free and fair elections. Australia is also aware that refugees are being encouraged to return to Burundi, often after long absences. We highlight the need for Burundi to ensure returns are safe, voluntary and dignified. Australia is concerned by reports of vilification of LGBTI persons. We call on the Burundian authorities to end discriminatory practices against LGBTI persons. Australia encourages the government of Burundi to engage fully with the Commission of Inquiry, taking immediate steps to address the Commission's concerns. Thank you.
I thank you. I give the floor to Switzerland.
Monsieur
Mr. Vice President, Switzerland thanks the Commission of Inquiry for its update. The human rights situation in Burundi remains extremely concerning following the constant shrinking of civil space and increased pressure on journalists, certain members of civil society and international NGOs. Switzerland calls on the Burundian authorities to respect and fully protect human rights, to release all political prisoners and to enable the media, both national and international, civil society and international NGOs, to do their work without any barriers and without fear of reprisals. With a view to the upcoming elections, Switzerland appreciates the decision for presidential candidates to alternate taken by the party in power and the already clear participation of the opposition. Switzerland urges the Burundian authorities to do everything in their power to ensure the holding of peaceful, inclusive, free and transparent elections. Throughout the electoral cycle, we have called for zero tolerance to violence, hate speech and human rights violations, and we recall the responsibility of the authorities to bring the perpetrators of such acts to justice. Switzerland also calls on all political parties to promote dialogue in order to prevent electoral violence. Ladies and gentlemen, experts, what do you believe are the priority measures to ensure that the electoral process can be peaceful and credible? I thank you.
Je vous remercie.
I thank you. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, sir. France thanks you personally for the humanist way in which you are guiding our debates. So France thanks the International Commission of Inquiry for its work and renews its full support to that. The general elections in May 2020 must be an opportunity for Burundi to definitively emerge from the crisis which has been ongoing since 2015. President Nkurunziza's announcement that he would not seek a new mandate is the first step to this. It must be followed by the holding of credible, inclusive and peaceful elections, and the work of the Commission can contribute to that. It is why, in this pre-electoral context, the full cooperation of Burundian authorities with international organizations and the international human rights protection mechanisms is more essential than ever. In order to put an end to the serious human rights violations and fundamental freedoms, this is vital. My country encourages the Burundian authorities to take all necessary measures to put an end to any potential summary executions and enforce disappearance, acts of torture and sexual violence, including violations committed by the members of the National Intelligence Service, the police or the Imbonerakure. France calls on the authorities of Burundi to effectively combat impunity. The perpetrators of these violations continue to unfortunately benefit from this. In order to restore a climate of trust in light of the upcoming elections, France also calls on the authorities to ensure unhindered humanitarian access in respect for humanitarian principles in order to enable international organizations to provide assistance to the most vulnerable groups of the population, including IDPs and refugees. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Ambassador. I now give the floor to Luxembourg.
Mr.
Vice President, Luxembourg fully aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union. My delegation thanks the Commission of Inquiry for its presentation and remains deeply concerned by the human rights situation in Burundi, in particular in light of the upcoming presidential elections. The climate of impunity prevails, as does the clampdown on the civic space given the restrictions and increased controls and checks that the government is imposing on civil society and the press. We call on the Burundian authorities to release without delay and unconditionally the 4 journalists, Iwaku Christine Kamikaze, Agnes Ndirobusa, Terence Mpozinzi and Egide Harerimana, who have been sentenced following a procedure which did not respect the guarantees of due process. We urge the Burundian authorities to do everything to ensure that the civil and political rights of this pre-electoral period are guaranteed for the population in cooperation with international mechanisms and regional human rights mechanisms, including and in particular the Commission of Inquiry, which is mandated by this Council. To the members of the Commission of Inquiry, in your last report you warned that the pre-electoral period could provoke an increased violence. In light of this, what measures would you recommend to the Burundian authorities and to those of neighbouring countries in order to respond to the likely increasing refugee movements? Thank you. Thank you. I now give the floor to the Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the EU statement. We welcome President Nkurunziza's decision not to participate in the 2020 elections and the fact that some members of the opposition in exile have been able to return to Burundi. However, the overall human rights situation in Burundi remains of deep concern. The level of arbitrary arrests and killings of political opposition members, the general climate of intimidation and the persistent impunity is increasingly worrisome. We call on the authorities to guarantee press freedom, freedom of expression and freedom of assembly and association, and to take the measures necessary to ensure that foreign and domestic NGOs can operate freely. We call on the government to revoke its decision to declare members of the Commission of Inquiry personae non gratae. Concrete steps by the Burundian authorities to credibly address these and other human rights issues would help the Netherlands to regain the necessary trust in the viability of the normalization of our relationship with Burundi. In this context, we are in favor of having a dialogue between the Burundian authorities and the EU heads of delegation in Bujumbura. Peaceful and credible elections, monitored by the international community, have the potential to reshape the relations of Burundi with the rest of the world. Mr. Dien, do you see significant developments regarding the risk factors you identified in September? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ambassador, Ireland has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Ireland aligns with the statement of the European Union. Ireland would like to thank the Commission of Inquiry for its presentation and reaffirm our support for your ongoing work. As on previous occasions, Ireland calls on the government of Burundi to ensure that adequate political and civil society space exists to allow for inclusive, democratic and transparent elections in May 2020. Ireland recalls the need for the Government of Burundi to ensure that fundamental freedoms are upheld in the run-up to the elections, including freedom of expression, freedom of assembly and freedom of the press. Ireland reiterates its deep concern about reports of human rights violations, including extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances and torture, and calls on the Government of Burundi to ensure that such violations are fully investigated. Ireland is pleased to note recent reports which indicate that steps are being taken which will contribute to free and fair elections without violence, as well as return of refugees, and we note the recent positive visit of the Peace Building Commission. Ireland again strongly urges the Government of Burundi to engage with the OHCHR and all UN human rights mechanisms in a constructive manner, and to engage fully with the Commission of Inquiry, granting full access and the protections required to complete the Commission's important mandate. Noting the serious challenges faced by the Commission of Inquiry and the OHCHR to fulfil their mandate as a result of barriers of access to Burundi, could you elaborate further on any potential roadmap for the continuation of engagement in Burundi, and in particular, any new opportunities which may exist following the election of a new president in May? Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Myanmar.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. My delegation takes note of the oral update of the Commission of Inquiry on Burundi. Myanmar thanks the delegation of Burundi for their presentation of the situation in the country, and we also wish to commend the constructive efforts made by the government of Burundi in the field of human rights. Mr. Vice President, any action taken to improve the human rights situation of a country should be based on the principle of cooperation and dialogue and consent of the concerned country. We are of the view that promotion and protection of human rights for all should be guided by the principles of universality, objectivity, non-selectivity, and avoidance of double standards and politicization. We wish to reiterate that UPR mechanism is the only suitable forum to address human rights issues, providing equal treatment to all UN member states through dialogues, comments, suggestions, and recommendations in good faith. In this regard, we call for the international community to continue their support to the Burundi's endeavors in the promotion and protection of human rights by providing technical assistance and assisting for the capacity building. I thank you.
I thank you. I give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Mr. Vice President, the prevailing trend in Burundian internal political processes is one of stabilization, as attested to by the ever-dwindling number of attacks on civilian infrastructure committed by members of the radical opposition. We remain in favor of respect for Burundi's sovereignty. We believe that responsibility for ensuring human rights within the territory falls to the authorities of that state. We would indicate here that it is unacceptable to interfere in Bujumburu's internal affairs, including in the context of the May 2020 general elections. We note progress in preparing for the ballot. The electoral calendar has been agreed and is being observed. Elections are to be funded from the national budget, and within political parties, the process for selecting candidates is in full swing. Evidence of the gradual improvement in the situation in the country comes from the process of return of refugees to Burundi, primarily from Tanzania. At the same time, however, the economic situation in Burundi remains of concern. We take a view that further progress would enable renewed economic support for Burundi, as called for repeatedly by members of the African Union. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Venezuela. Thank you, Vice President. Venezuela recognizes the political will demonstrated by the Burundian government to improve the human rights situation in the country and its firmness countering the imposition of this hostile mandate. At the right time, my delegation voted against this mandate. It's been shown that the imposition of mandates against specific countries do in no way contribute to improving the situation of human rights. They are inefficient and generate high costs which are not compatible with the current situation of precarity given available resources. they, in short, lead to no positive results. These mandates openly violate the universal principles of the right to self-determination of peoples, respect for sovereignty and non-interference in domestic affairs of states enshrined in the UN Charter. We must give due credence to Resolution 60/251 of the General Assembly. It is only through genuine dialogue and cooperation between states that we can move towards effective promotion and protection of human rights across the world. We will continue to push for the total eradication of these politicized mandates against sovereign states in the work of this Council. We provide full support to the EPR, which is the most important mechanism of this Council, which has proven to be the ideal and most effective way of addressing human rights situations in all countries on an equal footing. Thank you. Thank you. I give the floor to China.
副主席先生，近年来，布隆迪政府为维护国
Thank you. For years now, thanks to the efforts of the Burundian government, efforts have been taken to stabilize and reconcile the country. National security has continued to improve, and we commend Burundi for that. We welcome the measures adopted by the government to promote socio-economic development and to protect human rights. International society and the international community must respect the initiative of the government and people of Burundi to strengthen economic cooperation and development aid with a view to achieving a transparent political process in the country in preparation for the general elections in May 2020. In the area of human rights, China has always favored dialogue and constructive cooperation instead of bringing pressure to bear under the pretext of human rights and to prevent politicization of human rights. China has noted the objection expressed by the government of Burundi on many occasions as regards the establishment of a commission of inquiry in the country. The commission must respect the sovereignty of the country and must acknowledge the efforts undertaken by the government. It must take an objective stance and must mistrust unreliable information and must renounce all attempts to complicate the country's situation. Thank you. Thank you. I give the floor to Belgium.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you, sir. Belgium aligns itself with the statement of the European Union and would like to make the following comments. My delegation thanks the Commission of Inquiry for its work and for its statement, while deeply regretting the attitude of Burundi towards the Commission, which has been uncooperative. The human rights situation continues to require our great attention, in particular in light of the imminent legislative and presidential elections. The electoral process underway represents an opportunity to consolidate Burundian democracy. Nonetheless, this process does also bear some risks for human rights in the country. Therefore, the pre-electoral period is unfolding in a context of unacceptable restrictions on the democratic space and a hindrance to fundamental freedoms. It is peppered with acts of violence, intimidation and harassment in full impunity. We recall that Burundi is obliged to respect the rights enshrined in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. We request that all perpetrators of human rights violations be brought to justice. My country invites the government of Burundi to fully cooperate with regional and international organizations which may support the country in organizing credible, equitable, inclusive and free elections. Thank you, sir.
Merci. Je donne la parole au
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The United Kingdom reaffirms its full support for the Commission of Inquiry and welcomes this presentation. The UK remains concerned by the human rights situation in Burundi, in particular ahead of the May 2020 elections. We are concerned by the restriction of democratic space and reports of pre-election violence, including violence against political parties' members. We urge the Burundian government to ensure the May 2020 elections are peaceful and inclusive. The UK welcomes the succession of Evariste Ndayishimiye as leader of the CNDD-FDD and as its presidential candidate for the elections. This is a positive and important step for Burundi's democratic trajectory. We now call on the government to promote unity within the CNDD-FDD party and more broadly across the country to minimise the risk of violence being triggered by the electoral process. It is also crucial the government enables opposition parties to operate effectively. Ensuring the 2020 elections are peaceful, credible and inclusive will be a welcome step forward in the protection of human rights within the country. Mr Vice President, we would welcome the Commissioner's views on what can be done by the international community to support peaceful and inclusive elections in Burundi. Thank you.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you. I give the floor to the United Republic of Tanzania.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The United Republic of Tanzania values the work of the Human Rights Council and its various organizations and mechanisms. Having said that, Tanzania wishes to express its strong objection to the statement made by the Chair of the Council of the Commission of Inquiry on Burundi that voluntary nature of the Burundian refugees who are repatriated from Tanzania was doubtful. Mr. Vice President, as we have had occasion to state in this Council, Tanzania has always abided by the principle of voluntariness in the repatriation of all refugees to their countries of origin, including those from Burundi, and will continue to do so. So far, all refugees who have been repatriated did register voluntarily, and the repatriation was facilitated by UNHCR. Finally, Tanzania calls on UNHCR and the international community to provide all the necessary resources for the repatriation of all Burundian refugees in Tanzania. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Merci. Ceci est la dernière intervention.
Thank you. This was the last statement. We will now move on to the list of non-governmental organizations. And I now call on the representative of the Centre pour les droits civils et politiques, who will be delivering a joint statement. You have the floor. Thank you, Vice President. The signatory organizations remain concerned by grave violations of human rights in Burundi. They strongly condemn the acquittal on appeal, or the confirmation rather, of the sentence of 32 years for Mr. Germain Rukuki for his work with ACAT Burundi, and of Nestor Numatengi, sentenced to 5 years in prison. They also condemn the arrest of 4 journalists from Iwaku on the 22nd of October 2019 and the conviction on the 30th of January in view of their work in Bubanza. International media outlets are not spared, as indicated by the withdrawal of the BBC's operating license on the 26th of March 2019 and the extension of the suspension of broadcasts by Voice of America. The 2020 electoral context and current tensions lead us to fear violent clashes. A number of reports indicate intimidation, primarily by members and supporters of CNDD-FDD against political opponents, with a total of 47 killings, 102 arbitrary arrests, and 15 instances of torture in the 3 final months of 2019. Burgeoning intolerance and ethnic hate speech is also of concern. This hate speech is fostered by the controversial exhumation of the remains of victims of past crimes since December 2019 by the Truth Commission, with members who are close to the CNDD party. Thank you, the Vice President. Time is up.
To East and the Horn of Africa Human Rights Defenders Project.
Mr. Vice President, distinguished members of the Commission of Inquiry, in September 2019, the Council decided to extend the mandate of the Commission and to keep Burundi under high surveillance. Since then, in the run-up to the presidential election, the human rights situation has not improved in the country. The pre-electoral period is marked by grave and ongoing violations, including arbitrary detention, extrajudicial execution, and a crisis in civil society space. The government and the CNDD-FDD party and members of Imbonerakure continue to engage in intimidation and limit the prospects for a free and fair election. We are also concerned at violence in refugee camps, and the risk factor approach remains relevant here. We reiterate our call for the authorities to bring an end to repression and to bring perpetrators of violence to justice with immediate release of prisoners of conscience, particularly Germain Rukuki, Nestor Mutenga, and the journalists Agnès Niedrubusa, Christine Kamikaze, Eji Terimina, and Terence Mopenzi. We urge Burundi once again to change direction and to work with the OHCHR and to enable the office to operate once again in the country and to engage in dialogue with the Commission of Inquiry. Distinguished Commission members, at this stage, on the basis of the risk factors and indicators that you have identified, what could be done to encourage the regional international actors to continue to... The President's time is up. Thank you. I now give the floor to Reporters Without Borders International.
Mr. Vice President, I am speaking on behalf of Reporters Without Borders to express our serious concern regarding the press freedom situation in Burundi, in particular the cases of 4 journalists working for Iwachu, one of the last remaining independent media outlets in the country. On 31st January, 4 Iwachu reporters were sentenced to 30 months in prison for attempted complicity in a violation of internal state security. They had been arrested on the 22nd of October while attempting to cover a rebel incursion into the country. These journalists were targeted for no reason other than their journalism, and their imprisonment is intended to send a signal to others who still dare to cover sensitive issues ahead of the country's upcoming presidential election in May. This takes place against the backdrop of an overall dire press freedom situation in Burundi, ranked 159th out of 180 countries in RSF's World Press Freedom Index. Most independent radio stations remain closed, dozens of journalists are unable to return from exile abroad, and those who have stayed face frequent harassment by security forces and pro-regime militia. Newsrooms are dominated by fear, resignation, and self-censorship. We note with concern the continued lack of information regarding the disappearance of Iwachu journalist Jean Bigirimana more than 3 years ago after he was abducted by intelligence services. We call on UN member states to take urgent action to hold Burundi to account for these serious violations. Intimidation and arbitrary arrests of journalists must be immediately ceased. Press freedom and access to information must be respected during the May presidential election. Independent journalism is dying in Burundi and will not survive much longer if this alarming trend is not immediately reversed. Thank you.
I thank you. I give the floor to Rado. La parole est à Rado.
Mr. Vice President, RADO welcomes the oral update by the Commission of Inquiry on Burundi and renews its support for the Commission. The hostility of the Burundian delegation against the Commission demonstrates the lack of political will to change the human rights situation. RADO shares the Commission's view that inclusive dialogue and the holding of credible and peaceful presidential elections remain key to ending the political crisis. Furthermore, journalists should be allowed to carry out their job without intimidation or fear of reprisals. This includes human rights defenders, political opponents, and Burundians returning from abroad. In light of the persistent and prevailing human rights violations and abuses in Burundi since 2015, it is regrettable that the Burundian authorities have consistently failed to effectively engage with United Nations human rights mechanisms. The Commission of Inquiry on Burundi has reported the occurrence of crimes against humanity in Burundi, crimes perpetrated by the Burundian security forces and the ruling party's youth league, the Imbonerakure. We therefore invite the government of Burundi to muster the political will to bring about urgent improvement to the deplorable human rights situation in the country. Given the gravity of these violations and the importance of fighting against impunity, especially in the context of the upcoming elections, we ask the Commission what more can be done under the relevant UN mechanisms, as well as those of the African Union, to ensure accountability and prevent further human rights abuses and violations. Thank you.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you. I give the floor to Amnesty International.
Mr. Vice President, we thank the Commission for its oral update. Since the run-up to the 2015 elections, Burundian authorities have sought to stifle all forms of dissent. With the 2020 elections fast approaching, they have intensified the restrictive measures. 2 recent actions are particularly concerning. On 30th of January, 4 journalists from Iwachu Media House were sentenced to 2.5 years in prison for what the court deemed an impossible attempt to threaten internal state security. They had been arrested in October while en route to report on clashes in Bubanza province. The evidence presented against them centered on a joke sent in a text text message. We urge the authorities to immediately and unconditionally release them, as they have been imprisoned solely for the exercise of their right to freedom of expression. In February, the government renewed its efforts to obstruct the work of and intimidate international NGOs by demanding personal information on all employees, including names and ethnic identities. The government did not mention if any safeguards were in place to protect privacy or avoid discrimination based on ethnicity, or indeed why these organizations are the only private entities being asked to respect ethnic quotas designed for state institutions. We urge Burundi to drop this intrusive request that is ultimately interfering with the right to association, and to let all NGOs, national or international, operate freely and safely. Mr. Vice President, a question for the Commission of Inquiry. What are your priority recommendations towards ensuring the forthcoming elections take place in an atmosphere in which voters can freely exercise information and meaningful debate is protected and facilitated? I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to United Nations Watch.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. United Nations Watch thanks the Commission of Inquiry for its update. In September, at the opening of the UN General Assembly, Burundi's Foreign Minister, Ezekiel Nibigira, said that all Burundians enjoy full civil and political rights, and that his government has taken, quote, positive gestures. We wish to ask the Commission, do you agree? The Commission has documented gross violations of human rights committed by the government of Burundi and its proxies, which enjoy impunity for their crimes. An election will be held in May. This should be a turning point for democracy, yet this could actually be a catalyst for more violence. As documented in the report, Burundi carries out arbitrary detentions targeting members of the opposition, as well as extrajudicial killings. It retaliates against opponents of the 2018 constitutional reform. It censors local and international media, and increasingly obstructs the work of human rights defenders. We wish to ask the Commission, do you agree that these violations only move Burundi further away from reconciliation and democratization? Will you closely monitor the electoral process and demand that Burundi put an end to such abuses? If so, then this year's election could yet be a step forward towards democracy. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Civicus.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Civicus and independent Burundian civil society organizations welcome the important work of the Commission of Inquiry and thank the Commission for its update. The human rights and security situation remains perilous. Forced disappearances and arbitrary detention of opponents and other dissenting voices continue unabated. In January 2020, Jacques Nibigira, Gilbert Daishimiye, Eslon Shinibogoye and Juma were arrested by the Burundian Intelligence Service. Their whereabouts remain unknown. In October 2019, 4 journalists were arbitrarily arrested while investigating rebel activities. In January 2020, journalist Blaise Pascal Carré-Moye was detained incommunicado for 5 days and released without any charges. Freedom of speech, access to information and association remain restricted. There have been violent attacks by the ruling party youth wing on members of other political parties. We call on the government of Burundi to grant access to and fully cooperate with UN Human Rights Council mechanisms, including the Commission of Inquiry, and we call on the Human Rights Council to take serious heed of the Commission's analysis of risk factors and take steps to prevent atrocities and ensure that the government of Burundi is held accountable for its human rights violations. We ask the Commission its plans to deploy an observation mission before, during and after the upcoming elections to report on election-related human rights violations and help prevent the escalation of electoral violence. Thank you.
I thank you. I give the floor to international organization for the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are deeply troubled to note the continued media censorship, intimidations, hate speech, reprisals, and violence taking place in Burundi, resulting in the clashes between security forces and the extrajudicial killings that took place in late February of this year. The timing of these clashes is of deep concern, as it signifies possible links with the upcoming electoral period in May 2020. Ford and Geneva International Center for Justice would like to highlight the recent reports stating that at least 6 activists were murdered, while others reported missing and are allegedly being tortured, and some 200 are suffering imprisonment. In light of this, we reiterate that freedoms of expression, association, and assembly, including political participation, are fundamental civil, political, and social rights. These are principal elements towards a peaceful democracy. Mr. President, in conclusion, we first ask the Commission what recommendations are being formulated to hold all perpetrators, including those of Imbonerakure, of human rights violations and abuses to account. Second, what steps are being taken in collaboration with necessary stakeholders to not only improve the human rights situation, but what is specifically being done to de-escalate tensions and prevent repeated violence that limit political freedoms and liberties towards the upcoming elections? Thank you.
Thank you. Était la dernière.
This was the last statement. I will now give the floor to Mr. Dien for his concluding remarks. You have the floor, sir. I would like to give the floor to my colleagues from the Commission to address the questions that have been raised.
Madame Françoise Hampson.
Ms. Françoise Hampson. Firstly, with regard to the risk factors, in the 2019 report, the Commission confirmed the existence in the current Burundian context of 8 risk factors identified within the analysis of criminal atrocities, with a significant number of indicators for each of those risk factors. There has been no particular development in terms of the structural factors, factors 2 and 3, but there have nonetheless been various contextual factors which have become more marked than they were in September. With regard to the electoral process, in order for the 2020 elections to take place against a peaceful backdrop of being credible, fair and transparent, the Commission has made recommendations to the Burundian authorities in its 2019 report from September of that year. All of these recommendations remain entirely valid. With regard to refugees, only through renewed inter-Burundian dialogue and credible, fair and transparent elections will it be possible to avoid a potential risk of an upturn in refugee movements. Only the implementation of all of our report recommendations will be able to bring about a situation in Burundi where Burundians can return home enjoying full security. I now give the floor to my colleague. Vice President, by way of conclusion, the main thrust of the reply has been given by Ms. Hampson, and also in my presentation, which was a collective endeavour. By way of conclusion, Vice President, allow me to say that we would like to convey to the Council the following. The Burundian crisis has been ongoing for a number of years. It is marked by repeated violations of human rights. But I would also note that Burundi is entering a very delicate period in the run-up to elections, and it has always been in the context of elections in Burundi that the worst human rights violations have taken place. We make the following appeal, as we have heard also from the Council, and that relates to the way in which the elections take place, and that will be the acid test of the credibility of improvements in the situation in Burundi. In short, our main conclusion is to call for the Council and the international community to remain vigilant, to ensure that democratic forces within and outside of Burundi can actually give rise to real transformation in the country. I thank you. I thank you. This brings us to the end of this interactive dialogue. I would like to thank Mr. Dien, Ms. Asogbo and Ms. Hampson for their presence and their participation. Once again, thank you.
Mesdames et messieurs, nous allons...
Ladies and gentlemen, we will now move on to the interactive dialogue with the International Independent Commission of Inquiry on the Syrian Arab Republic. The list of speakers will close in 15 minutes. I have the honor to welcome to the podium the members of the Commission of Inquiry, Mr. Paulo Sergio Pinheiro, Ms. Karen Koning Abu Zaid, and Mr. Hani Megali. At this juncture, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Paulo Sergio Pinheiro for his presentation.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Vice President. Excellencies.
This date marks the 27th time, I repeat, 27th time I have addressed this body. The images of Idlib speak for themselves. The schools, hospitals, bakeries, markets and homes have been obliterated. Civilians are fleeing either on foot or crammed on trucks heading north. Families burn clothes and remaining belongings in an attempt to keep their children and babies from freezing to death. Since December, nearly 1 million people have been displaced, stranded in a rapidly shrinking enclave. 80% are women and children. They bear the greatest burden. Concurrent with these developments, the terrorist group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, have carried out attacks on civilian inhabited areas under the control of the government. They have killed dozens of women, men and children, spreading fear amongst the civilian population, pushing many to flee. They are also detaining activists, journalists and other individuals that dare to criticize the group. The response by pro-government forces has been disproportionate. Hundreds of Syrians have been killed in near-constant bombardments during the period under review. Their aerial attacks and ground offensives led to displacement on an unparalleled scale and were characterized by the failure to abide by the legal obligation not to direct attacks against civilian targets. These attacks appeared intended to terrorize civilians in apparent effort to depopulate parts of Idlib and accelerate its capture. More than 3 million people remain trapped in northern Idlib. The near absence of humanitarian aid is causing a severe shortage of food and basic necessities. Children have frozen to death for want of shelter. Pregnant women are left without enough food and medical care. Monsieur le Président, Excellences,
President, Excellencies.
The Al-Hol camp remains desperate. 1 year after the territorial defeat of the Islamic State, women and children with familial links to terrorist fighters continue to be interned in camps. They remain in a legal limbo. Children should first and foremost be seen as victims and survivors. Member States must respect the principle of the best interests of the child and urgently repatriate girls and boys. Aside from warfare, violations by all parties to the conflict, continue to be committed throughout the country. Those in previously besieged areas, including Ghouta, Dara and Douma, are straining for basic resources amid the widespread lawlessness and insecurity. Arbitrary arrests and cumbersome administrative procedures, in addition to the combination of complex changes to property legislation and myriad movement restrictions, have been used to punish and ensure obedience. The launch of Operation Peace Spring in northeastern Syria has caused another wave of displacement. More than 100,000 civilians fled within 24 hours between 10 and 11 October. As aerial and ground offensives intensified, army groups operating under the umbrella of the Syrian National Army engaged in looting and property confiscation of residents, schools, land and civilians' vehicles. In Afrin and adjacent areas, armed groups operating under the umbrella of the SNA regularly arrest, detain, torture or extort residents of Kurdish origin, in addition to looting and confiscating their properties in a widespread manner. In areas affected by Operation Peace Spring, as well as in Afrin, armed groups generate a fear of violence and duress among the female Kurdish and Yazidi population, confining women to their homes and forcing others to relinquish their jobs. Monsieur le Président, Excellences, the ceasefire announced by Presidents Putin and Erdogan in the northwest of Syria should bring reprieve to the civilian population and provide space for desperately needed humanitarian aid to reach civilians. This agreement, the ceasefire, can be a path to ensure a permanent cessation of hostilities and further access to humanitarian assistance and enhanced human rights protections for all. At the very last, this agreement, it is an opportunity that should not be missed. Time and again, Syrians have paid the price for the continuation of this war. Many states still provide support in furtherance of competing agendas, but none of their priorities include the needs of the Syrian survivors. As Lakhdar Brahimi said 4 years ago, what he said 4 years ago continues to be completely valid. None of the priorities of the Syrian survivors are taken by the states and groups involved in this conflict. To heal the divides that have torn the Syrian society apart, there must be meaningful accountability, justice and remedies for the myriad violations and crimes committed by all parties to the conflict. The complete disregard for international norms must not continue 9 years before the beginning of the conflict. States are the guarantors of international human rights and humanitarian law. Failure to respect this body of law erodes protection everywhere in Syria. The war decimated a significant number of the male Syrian population. 1 year after the unanimously adopted Resolution 2474 of 2019, the state has not yet taken measures to search for the missing, enable the return of their remains, or to account for their disappearance. The anguish that families endure as a result of the enforced disappearance of their relatives is a grave human rights violation in itself. Tens of thousands of Syrians are languishing in secret detention. It's long overdue that families are informed of their fate and whereabouts and allowed to visit them. International humanitarian organizations must be allowed access to them, and those who are arbitrarily detained must be released. Such basic respect for human rights is not dependent on a peace agreement and should happen now. Thank you. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you. In line with usual practice, we will begin by hearing from the delegation of the country concerned. I now give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic. You have 5 minutes.
Excellence.
Thank you, Vice President. A number of countries continue their efforts to use this Council as a forum for political targeting in contradiction with the UN Charter. This charter, which underscores the need to deal with the human rights through dialogue and international cooperation in a manner that respects the national sovereignty of countries as well as their territorial integrity and unity, while refraining from interference in their domestic affairs. The general debate on the situation in Syria, the only situation which is taken up in all sessions of the Council, is one most outstanding example of excessive politicization of the work of the Council. In this context, the Commission of Inquiry, which was established in 2011 and is set to have its mandate extended 1 year more in order to promote for baseless allegations that serve the interest of those which would like to tarnish the image of the government of Syria, while undertaking an erroneous approach that distorts the reality and ignores the American and Turkish assault and their illegal occupation of parts of Syria and stealing of its resources, while ignoring activities by terror groups which commits crimes and impose lifestyles on people, which is very similar to that which was imposed by Daesh in the place it used to control in the past. It's worth condemning that the committee describes these organizations, which include thousands of foreign terrorists, as opposition. Our government is determined to protect its people against crimes of terrorism, and it protects its territories against American and Turkish occupation, which uses terrorism and threatens the territorial integrity, unity, and sovereignty of Syria. This way, we practice a right that is envisaged in the UN Charter, the international law, and the Human Rights Council, the Security Council resolutions. We stress that our military operations in Idlib and all over Syria is in line with our international commitment as well as our national commitment to protect our people while preserving our national unity and territorial integrity. Our recent operations freed millions of Halab residents of the terror of discriminate missile shelling, which targeted and killed thousands of people over the last years. It also helped end their humanitarian suffering, as we see that the airport and the highways leading to it are operational yet again. Over the recent operations, the government opened the humanitarian corridors and called upon civilians to use them. However, Jabhat al-Nusra's shelling of the crossing points and the roads loading them compelled people to go to the Turkish borders in order to fabricate a humanitarian crisis that allowed the regime of Erdogan to instrumentalize them. After liberation of large swathes of Halab and Idlib, we see that normal life is coming back to these areas and that infrastructure is being rehabilitated and a provision of services in order to create conditions for the return of people, as was the case of previous zones which were liberated. 19,000 of the residents in Rukban camp have returned thanks to facilitations provided by our government, and that return was verified by the UN. It verified also that none of them stayed in the shelters, contrary to allegations set forth by the Commission. The government informed the UN resident coordinator that it approves the transfer of humanitarian assistance through contact lines on condition that they reach those who deserve them. It also allowed the entry of medical assistance at crossing point of Yarubia through Kamishli Airport to be delivered in coordination between the government and the UN. The Commission does not reflect these truths in its report. Therefore, we reiterate our rejection to renew the mandate of the committee and its report, which flies in the face of reality, and we reject its accusations and findings of reports which are rife of contradictions, as well as its methods of work which are not objective. We also reject its double standards in sending accusations left and right against our government and its allies, while it defends the Turkish assaults justified its crimes on our lands in Idlib, Ifrin, Jarablus, Bab, Ras Al Ain, Kamishli, among others. We stress that the Commission's refusal to hold the Turkish regime responsible for these violations and crimes of groups which it uses to serve its priorities and policies inside Syria and inside Libya is the legal heresy and a manipulation that we reject. In conclusion, we stress that putting an end to the humanitarian suffering means that we end hypocrisy, politicization, and not use terrorism and impose political conditions to ensure humanitarian response, and also to create the conditions for return of displaced. This will be conducted by providing safety and security to the civilians, and not through safe zones, which Erdogan wants to promote to serve his expansionist ends. And thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I should like to inform the delegation that the list of speakers is now closed. I now invite interested delegations to ask questions of the members of the Commission of Inquiry and to make comments on the presentation. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union.
Merci, Monsieur le Vice-Président.
Thank you, Vice President.
The military offensive in Idlib by the Syrian regime and its backers represents a serious threat to international peace and security. The European Union urges the regime to return to the negotiating table and repeats that any sustainable solution to the conflict requires a genuine political transition. The European Union expresses strong support to the work of the Commission of Inquiry. The latest report highlights the continued blatant disregard by all actors for civilian life, dignity and infrastructure. We urge all parties to the conflict to immediately cease hostilities and to respect international law. We express particular outrage at the deliberate targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure, including systematic targeting of medical facilities by pro-government forces in the northwest, and take special note of the Commission's assessment that at least 2 of these acts were carried out with the participation of its allies. We welcome the Commission's continued investigation into all incidents throughout Syria, including in the northeast, and echo the call on the Turkish authorities to launch their own investigations and make findings public. We condemn in the strongest terms the continued use of arbitrary arrests and detentions and enforced disappearances in areas retaken by the regime. The fates of those detained, disappeared and missing must be revealed and investigated in line with international standards, and rule of law should be restored. Finally, a question to conclude. What immediate steps could be taken to prevent human rights violations against women?
Thank you, Ambassador. The time's up. Denmark on behalf of a group of countries, please.
Mr. Vice President, I deliver this statement on behalf of the Nordic countries. Recent developments in Syria remind us of the regime's brutality. A serious humanitarian catastrophe is unfolding as civilians desperately flee the regime's offensive in the northwest. We condemn the unacceptable attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. As the COI has warned, the deliberate and systematic targeting of hospitals may amount to war crimes. Violations of international law are rampant. All parties to the conflict must live up to their obligations under international law, including IAEA, and respect human rights. We must insist on accountability for crimes committed. To this end, we reaffirm our strong support for the COI and the IIIM. Without a negotiated end to the conflict, the suffering will continue. We reiterate our full support for Special Envoy Peterson and a political settlement in line with the Security Council Resolution 2254. Conditions in areas retaken by regime illustrates that violations of international law will continue without a negotiated end to the conflict and genuine reforms. I thank you.
Thank you. UN Women has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. UN Women would like to thank the Commission for its efforts to document violations of women's and girls' human rights. Since 2011, UN Women has provided the Commission with specialised investigators, gender advisors, child rights advisors and interpreters in collaboration with Justice Rapid Response and OHCHR. These experts have been instrumental in documenting the rights violations in Syria presented today. The report of this Human Rights Council session highlights how women have been adversely affected by the conflict and how their rights continue to be undermined. UN Women wishes to echo the concerns expressed by the Commission with regard to the perpetration of sexual and gender-based violence against girls and boys, as well as the need for the meaningful provision of services for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence and gender-based violence. UN Women stands in solidarity with survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, demanding that their voices be heard. UN Women also joins the Commission of Inquiry in calling for a human rights-based approach in responding to the women and children of Syria, and call for the immediate implementation of the recommendations of its reports. We also call for a coordinated, victim-centred and human rights-based approach to documentation and justice. UN Women will continue to support the Human Rights Council in all of its efforts to bring justice to survivors and build inclusive peace in Syria so that women can peacefully participate and contribute to their communities. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Germany.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Germany aligns itself with the EU statement and we thank the Commission for their report. Mr. Chair, in Idlib a tragedy is unfolding as we speak. 3 million civilians are trapped in what Mark Lowkirk described as the biggest humanitarian horror story of the 21st century. Civilians are left without shelter from shelling and airstrikes. We call on all parties to the conflict, but in particular the Syrian regime and Russia, to stop attacks on civilians. These could, as the Commission has pointed out, amount to war crimes. The fight against terror can never be a pretext to disregard international law. Those responsible for crimes against international law must be held to account, and we commend and support the efforts of the IIIM and the Commission in this regard. Just last month in New York, we co-organized an informal meeting of the Security Council with the COI. It was an important opportunity to present the mandate of the Human Rights Council in New York. We deeply regret that the presentation could not occur in a formal meeting of the Security Council. Sustainable peace can only be achieved when human rights are respected. The Security Council cannot close its eyes to this reality. The COI provided an essential element in the UN Security Council's dealing with the situation in Syria. In concluding, efforts to reach a political solution under the auspices of the United Nations and guided by Security Council Resolution 2254 must be redoubled. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Merci, je donne la parole.
Thank you. I give the floor to Qatar.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We would like to thank the members of the International Commission of Inquiry, and we strongly condemn that the Syrian Authority have denied the Commission access to the country to carry out its mission. Now that we have entered the 10th year of the crisis in Syria, and yet we are hearing another report that reveals the size of the gross violations and heinous crimes that are being perpetrated against the Syrian people. We condemn the continued deteriorating situation, human rights situation and humanitarian situation of the Syrian people. We regret that there is no horizon for a political solution and that the Syrian regime insists, as well as its allies, to own the military and solution, and civilians and civilian facilities are the target of violence in Syria. This has had an impact on women, children, elderly, persons with disabilities. It is time that the international community shoulder its responsibility to take all measures to save the Syrian people and protect it, and to exert pressure on the Syrian regime to put an end to its military offensive and to start a political transition process on the basis of the Geneva I communique and Security Council Resolution 2254. It is important to hold responsible all of those who have committed human rights violations in Syria.
Mr. Vice President, the Czech Republic aligns itself with the intervention on behalf of the EU. We thank the Commission of Inquiry for its latest report. The Czech Republic remains upheld by serious violations and abuses of human rights, fundamental freedoms and all violations of international humanitarian law. Impunity for potential war crimes and crimes against humanity constitutes one of the greatest challenges to the protection of civilians, and ensuring accountability for such crimes is essential to preventing future violations. The perpetrators of international humanitarian law amounting to crimes under international law must be held accountable. In this regard, we called for the referral of the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court. We urge all parties to the conflict to cease attacks on civilians and civilian objects in accordance with their obligations under international humanitarian law, in particular against medical facilities, personnel and transport, and to comply with their obligation to take all feasible precautions to minimize harm to the civilian population.
Mr. President, the Czech Republic reiterates its full support to the Commission as well as to the mission of the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism. We strongly encourage all efforts to find a political solution to the conflict and to use all available diplomatic means to de-escalate violence in the northwest of the Syrian Arab Republic. Thank you very much.
Merci.
Thank you. Brazil has the floor.
Mr. Vice President, Brazil thanks the Commission for its report. We reaffirm the importance of its work to investigate violations and abuses from all sides involved in the conflict in Syria, including those providing arms and funds that enable such crimes. The latest escalation risks turning the crisis into a full-fledged international armed conflict with even worse impacts. Civilians in Idlib and elsewhere cannot continue to be victims of blunt disregard of the principles of distinction, proportionality and humanity. They cannot remain suffering under the yoke of UN-listed terrorist groups either. Brazil urges full implementation of the agreements on Idlib. We also deplore the countless violations of the rights of the child. For example, it's disturbing that some states, while advocating the lack of conditions for the safe return of Syrian refugees, continue to refuse to host Syrian children. Some even deprive their own children of nationality to leave them languishing in camps in Syria. They cannot call for the protection of children while being part in their very plight. Only a political solution will bring sustained progress. Brazil renews its support to the Special Envoy and encourages the Constitutional Committee to show the political will to move forward. I thank you.
Je vous remercie. Je donne
Thank you. I give the floor to Estonia.
Mr. Vice President, Estonia fully aligns itself with the statement by the EU. We value highly and continue to support the important work of the Commission. Estonia strongly condemns the recent surge of violence in the northwest of Syria. We take note of the outcome of the meeting between Russia and Turkey on 5th of March and the establishment of the ceasefire in Idlib. All warring parties need to put in place an immediate and sustainable ceasefire to guarantee the protection of civilians and to enable the unhindered access of humanitarian aid to all people in need. There is no justification to the military campaign of the Syrian regime and its backers, including Russia, but has caused massive displacement and number of civilian casualties in Idlib. Indiscriminate and deliberate attacks in densely populated areas is a brutal violation of international humanitarian law, amounting to war crimes and crimes against humanity. Estonia remains supportive of the need to refer the situation of Syria to the ICC. Estonia is deeply distressed about the brutality executed on children in this conflict, as detailed in the Commission's report from January this year. We urge all parties to stop the violations against children and to implement the conclusions of the Security Council Working Group on Children and Armed Conflict from 2019, as well as all relevant resolutions. It is important to keep this situation under the scrutiny of the Human Rights Council, and we call on all parties involved to cooperate fully with the Commission of Inquiry and implement immediately its latest recommendations. I thank you.
I thank you. I give the floor to Israel.
Ils sont pas là.
Absent. Switzerland, you have the floor. Mr. Vice President, over 2.1 million girls and boys have stopped regularly attending school, and 2.6 million children have been displaced internally multiple times. What will their future be? My Switzerland deplores the following 5 points. The fact that 1. Many children have been killed or injured since the beginning of the war. Switzerland recalls special protection to which children are subject to in line with international humanitarian law. 2. Destruction of school infrastructure is inadmissible. Schools must be protected from attacks and must in no way be used for military purposes. 3. Switzerland is concerned by the numerous cases of child recruitment by the armed groups and forces, and these are intolerant. We're intolerant of this. Children must not be recruited to participate in hostilities. Number 4, the many cases of detention of children as well as the treatment that they suffer. Switzerland recalls that arbitrary deprivation of liberty of children is prohibited. and that children must be considered as prioritarily as victims and treated as such. 5. Sexual violence and gender-based violence against girls and boys is unacceptable. These practices must immediately cease and the perpetrators be brought to justice. My country is concerned about these alarming conditions that many people are obliged to live in the northwest of the country, and deplores the flagrant disdain of the international humanitarian law. How can this situation in the northwest of Syria be addressed for children? Thank you.
Je vous remercie. Je donne la parole.
Thank you. I give the floor to Liechtenstein.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Liechtenstein thanks the Commission of Inquiry for the presentation of its report and its very important work. We are deeply concerned about the violence and humanitarian situation in and around Idlib, which led to more than 700,000 people being displaced and more than 3 million people trapped. We are appalled by the unwillingness of the warring parties to grant unhindered access to the area for humanitarian actors that are urgently needed in order to address the most basic needs of the civilian population. Incidents of alleged civil harm, ongoing enforced disappearances, the bombings of hospitals and schools, and many more violations and abuses of international human rights and humanitarian law need to be independently, impartially, and credibly investigated. Mr. Vice President, we reiterate the imperative of accountability with regard to all crimes committed under international law in Syria. To this end, we call on all states to fully cooperate with the IIIM for Syria. In particular, we put an emphasis on the principle of universal jurisdiction. Recent cases have shown that this is one way to fight impunity for the crimes committed in Syria. Furthermore, we reiterate our principled position that the Security Council must refer the situation in Syria to the ICC. Finally, we would like to express our continued strong support for the work and the mandate of the Commission of Inquiry. I thank you.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you. This is the last speaker that we could accommodate for this interactive dialogue today. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I have been informed that some delegations wish to exercise their right of reply. To that end, I give the floor to the representative of Iran.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, sir.
We regret that this afternoon some speakers tried to mislead this august body by giving false and misleading information about certain events and issues in my country. Human rights is a cornerstone for Iran's foreign and domestic policy. The core value of the Islamic Revolution is also human rights and its promotion. Iran has had many good records in promoting human rights of its nation. Iran has done a great job in promoting the human rights of other nations as well, through combating terrorism in our region. But the reward has been assassination of our national hero, General Qasem Soleimani, by the terrorist act of United States and by pressurizing Iran through politicization of human rights in this council. Iran is determined to respect and protect human rights of its citizens. But those malign actors that have a long record of interference in domestic affairs of other countries, including by inciting violence and terror acts through different channels, should be held accountable. Let me mention that respecting and securing peaceful assemblies and association are imperative. However, stirring and inciting violence are antithetic to human rights. We regret that a country who is violating the human rights by killing journalists in its diplomatic places and by killing innocent children and women in Yemen and is responsible for supporting terrorism and ISIS in our region try to mislead this body by accusing Iran and deluding the attention from its serious violations. Mr. Vice President, based on our constitution and Islamic values, all religious minorities have their free access to their rights in Iran and are holding their rituals freely and respectfully. They have their representative in parliament and have access to education and other rights. Let me once again reiterate our official position that the antithetical and counterproductive use of special procedures as a political leverage to pressurize other nations is a serious challenge towards promotion of human rights. Iran seeks to enhance cooperation with the High Commissioner's Office, thematic spatial procedures and UPR as non-selective and non-politicized mechanisms, and reaffirms its commitment to the protection and promotion of human rights and fundamental freedoms. But pressure through non-constructive approaches will not distract Iran from serving its people. Let me conclude by mentioning that the most recent grave and systematic violation of human rights is unilateral coercive measures, including unilateral sanctions. The United States has created an international sanction regime which amounts to a systematic violation of human rights. US and other countries that accompany with the sanctions, like Sweden, who abandon to provide EB children with their medicine needs, are responsible for violation of human rights. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Je vous remercie. Je donne la
Thank you. I give the floor to Myanmar.
Mr. Vice President, Myanmar delegation is exercising the right of reply in response to the statement made by the Bangladesh delegation during the discussion on the SG oral update on involvement of United Nations in Myanmar earlier today. Myanmar firmly believes that the Human Rights Council is a forum for constructive cooperation and dialogue in promotion and protection of human rights. While today's discussion in the Council was in the direction of how the United Nations system can make positive changes in order to effective implementation of UN work in assisting the concerned country at different levels, it is unfortunate that the statement made by the Bangladesh delegation has more of the confrontational sense rather than constructive approach. In this regard, we urge the delegation of Bangladesh to be more cooperative and try to better coordinate it with Myanmar in addressing the issues. Mr. Vice President, Myanmar wishes to reiterate our position, which we have repeatedly stated in our statements during different occasions, that the repatriation of the displaced persons in Cox's Bazar is the first priority of Myanmar government. Taking this opportunity, we call upon the delegation of Bangladesh to strictly follow the bilateral agreement signed between Myanmar and Bangladesh regarding the repatriation process for those people. I thank you.